Hi, and welcome to Accessible Web Mapping Apps. Michael and I are going to talk to you about what accessibility is, how to implement it in your maps and apps, and you'll learn a little bit about what ARIA, WCAG, and 508 compliance mean. So this is a general definition of what accessibility is. It's making your content usable by more people in more places. Ensuring your content is accessible means that people can use it, like in this example, on a crowded train where it's noisy and there's not a lot of space, but your content still is accessible and usable by a wide range of people. Spending time to build a more accessible website has lots of benefits, such as making your website available to a wider audience, not just those with disabilities. Things like increased usability, clarifying the design to make it easier to find and use content. And finally, the probably biggest reason people look at using accessibility is to avoid lawsuits. And the reason I think is most important is just because it's the right thing to do, is to ensure that more people have access to your content. So here's more on why. 15% of the world population lives with some form of a disability. So that's a big chunk of the population. And if your content is not reachable by them, you've lost out on that audience of users. And in some cases, that information could be life-saving information that's important for them to have, and they have difficulty accessing it. So in the US alone, 1 in 5 adults has a disability. And Michael will talk about colorblindness more a little bit later. But it's a huge percentage. About 8% of males have some degree of colorblindness. So we can take into account this information and build better websites. So there's a wide range of disabilities, and they can be categorized in sort of these 3 buckets. There's the permanent disability, which is what most of us think about when we think about building an accessible site. This is if you have missing limbs or you're permanently blind, maybe you're deaf or nonverbal, autistic, some of those other cognitive disabilities. So temporary disabilities can be things like an arm injury. So if you break your arm and it's in a cast, you're going to face some of the same issues accessing content as someone who's missing a limb. Same thing as if you're a new parent carrying a child or just a bag of groceries and trying to look up something on your phone or do something on your computer at the same time as you have that other hand occupied. So same thing with hearing. Hearing can be deaf, or maybe you're just on a noisy train and you want to watch a video. If that video has closed captioning, you can turn off the sound, turn on the captioning, and still get access to that video. So it's important to remember that there are non-permanent disabilities, and this increases those numbers we saw on the previous slide where we talked about 8% of males being colorblind and the percentages of people with disabilities in the world. Well, if you include temporary and situational disabilities, that number becomes much, much, much higher, right? So let's build our websites. Let's make them accessible. They'll be easier to use and better for everybody to access. So what is Esri doing in regards to disability? We have a website that I'm going to link you to. It's got some legal information and our statement on our commitment to accessibility. You can access the VPATs there. There's a link to the Esri email alias. So under here, you can get access to, again, information like the VPAT. There's a link to an email alias where you can email accessibility questions to Esri and get responses back. There is a GeoNet accessibility space. So if you log on to the GeoNet site and you search for an accessibility community, you'll find one there where you can ask questions and view some accessibility-related resources. So the next thing we want to talk about is how we accomplish accessibility. So the first thing that we're going to look at are these accessibility guidelines. So these guidelines are in the form of accessibility standards that the community as a whole has agreed on as ways to make your website more accessible. So there are a few different terms you're going to commonly hear regarding website accessibility standards, including WCAG, and then there's 2.0 version of WCAG and 2.1, and also Section 508. So each of these are standards that define how to make your web content accessible to people with disabilities. Section 508 is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. So this act required federal agencies to develop, procure, maintain, and use information and communication technology that is accessible to people with disabilities. But starting in January of 2018, the technical requirements of 508 were changed to incorporate WCAG 2.0 A and AA guidelines. So what you need to know, I think, if you're a federal agency that needs to comply with the Section 508 standards, is that you can just comply with WCAG 2.0 standards. And as of now, that is going to be the guideline that you want to look at. So 2.1 extends the 2.0 guidelines. So basically, if all your content conforms to WCAG 2.0 standards, it also conforms to 2.1 standards. 2.1 doesn't deprecate or supersede 2.0, but I think if you're building a new website now, I would encourage you to look at and start trying to incorporate the 2.1 standards to sort of future-proof your site in regards to accessibility. So just to recap, 2.0, WCAG 2.0 is sort of the de facto standard now. That's what you want to look at, and those are the resources that you want to study in order to make your site accessible. But if you want to ensure that your content is future-proof or work towards the future standards, that would be following WCAG 2.1. And in a few slides, we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between 2.0 and 2.1. So WCAG is defined in these 4 general principles. So WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they break it up into the principles of perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. An acronym that's often used for remembering that is POUR, P-O-U-R, POUR. So each of the principles has a set of success criteria that define things that you need to do to meet those standards. And there are also 3 levels. So generally you want to shoot for the level AA. So that's kind of the middle of the road standard. AAA has kind of a lot of extra nice to have things, but it can be expensive to add those extra things and also time consuming. So a good standard to shoot for is WCAG 2.0 AA compliance. And I have this linked. When you get the slides later, you'll be able to click on all these links. So this link takes you to the WCAG site. They've made some changes recently, and actually it's, I think that they're really good changes. So here's just the quick reference link. One of the nice things I like about it is that you can filter by the WCAG version. You can filter by the level. So if you only care about level AA, you can filter out those requirements. And then you can get different information on the technologies. Like, maybe we care about HTML, CSS, and ARIA, but we don't care about some of these other things because we're not working with those technologies. So we can apply those filters, and then we can see that, again, this site is organized by those 4 principles. So this is perceivable. And then these are all of the success criteria. So here's one issue where they talk about any non-text content that's presented has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. And then they give you information about caveats to this, how you can meet those guidelines. So it shows you techniques on how you can accomplish that. So example of this would be adding an alt attribute on an image element. So you can click here and you get more information about that. So this is a really great site for understanding what you as a developer need to do to ensure that you meet this criteria. So we already looked at this quick reference site. It's really usable, lots of great information. I encourage you to spend some time there reading through the criteria. Well, you don't have to memorize everything. It's worth becoming familiar with the criteria that are in each of those 4 categories so you know the kinds of things that you need to evaluate your site for. So I mentioned earlier WCAG 2.0 versus WCAG 2.1. 2.1 basically has 17 new criteria These new criteria generally address mobile accessibility, low vision users, and those with cognitive and learning disabilities. So w3.org has a great site with info on each of these new criteria, including some quotes from fictional users that I found really useful when trying to understand the criteria. So here's an example of one of these. So it's talking about it's impossible to read text if I have to scroll right and left after each line. It's disorienting and I lose my place. It makes it hard to understand what I'm reading. So then they have a quote that tells you what this fictional user says when it works well. I increased the text size 400% and it reflowed within the width of the window. I can read it easily without scrolling back and forth. And this is information on how to handle the new overflow criteria. So you'll see that there's more examples of these on the website. Here's one for a fictional supermarket assistant. And there's a bunch of them more in this What's New in WCAG 2.1 article. So for each of these new criteria, they have these fictional users. So they have a problem and a sample statement of what happens when the user thinks it works well. And when I read through, you read the criteria and sometimes it's a little technical, and then you can come down here and read these problem statements and work well statements, and it helps me clarify what that criteria is about and how to implement it. So that's another really great resource. So examples of the new criteria are orientation. So orientation, they say in 2.1 that you can't restrict the view to a single display or orientation. So for example, you can't say this site only works on landscape or only works on portrait mode. There is a caveat that says unless it's essential to have a particular orientation. Another one is target size. So there are some caveats to this one as well that are listed on the W3 site. But basically they say increase the size of pointer targets to at least 44 by 44 pixels. And the third example I have listed here is input purpose. And I really like this one. This one says that you have to programmatically provide additional information about form inputs so that assistive technologies can use that information to help do things like autocomplete form elements. So filling out usernames. I know all of us hate filling out forms on our phone, right? And we love it when that autocomplete just works. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about development and testing strategies.
Thanks, Kelly. My name is Michael Geig. I'm a UI UX designer and a front-end developer. And what would be an accessibility course without talking about development and testing strategies? So let's dive in. And at this point, I want to stress it, and I can't stress that enough. Accessibility is something that has to be in every developer's tool belt. That accessibility is one of the fundamentals that every developer just needs to know. It's like flexbox layouts, asynchronous calls, npm install. You get the point. If you want to be able to talk a language properly, then you have to know about accessibility. And it doesn't actually add effort. No, all the opposite. Following accessibility guidelines means writing better code. And now I will give you a couple of do's and don'ts. And if you follow those do's and don'ts, I promise you, you'll be halfway there. It's really that easy. So let's talk about it. So what are the do's? So the first one is really very straightforward. Use correct structure. It's like writing a Word document. You want to start with one title, and then you have subtitles, and then each subtitle, which is a section or a chapter, has, again, subtitles. So having this correct structure is something that the guidelines require from you, and having that in your document, in your HTML, will provide you better accessibility automatically. Another one is use landmarks. And landmarks got introduced with HTML5, and you can imagine landmarks being very similar to landmarks in real life, right? So you ask somebody for the way to the doctor's office, and they will tell you, well, first you go towards the church, and you pass the butcher, and then you see a fence. right? And so it's very similar in an HTML document. The screen reader needs those landmarks to orient itself and find certain sections like headers, articles, footers, and so on. So make use of those landmarks. The next one is use semantic elements. Uh, Whenever there is one, right? For example, excuse me, use a button instead of a span. And that has a couple of advantages because, first of all, a span you would have to style to make it look like a button, but then you also have to take care of the focusable state. You have to make sure that it's tabbable, right? So you have to uh, invest in all this extra effort just to make it work like the element that already exists. Uh, Forms are especially tricky. Whenever you have forms, a sighted user might easily be able to tell that a form element has a certain meaning, but that's not evident for somebody that is using a screen reader. So having a label associated with a form element is crucial for the understanding. So add labels whenever you can. But the same is true for alternative text. Whenever you have images, add an alt attribute. And not only add an alt attribute, but only make it meaningful, right? So you want to describe the image as if it wasn't visible. What are some of the don'ts? And it kind of touches on one of the do's that I had up there. Don't change native semantics. Don't give a div a role of a button. Just use a button. Don't remove elements from the natural tab order. So you can imagine as you tab through a document, the natural tab order is the order in which the elements are laid out throughout the DOM, the document object model. If you add a tab index, suddenly the cursor will jump from one place to another and it doesn't follow this natural tab order anymore. So this is actually a no-no. Don't ever use a tab index greater than 0. If you use a tab index equals 0, that means you're adding a tab order to an element that is not naturally tabbable. If you add a tab index of -1, means that you take an element out of its natural tab order and it cannot be tabbed to. But never ever use a tab index greater than 0. Another one, it seems to be obvious, but it's really important here, is don't quote unquote hide visible elements, right? If there's an element that is visible to a sighted user, don't use an ARIA hidden attribute and to actually hide it, because then the screen reader would not be able to access it, and vice versa. Don't show one that is hidden. So in terms of advanced strategies, I kind of already hinted at it, right? So we have these ARIA or WAI-ARIA attributes, and I kind of showed them already, but I wanted to outline them here again. There are some of them that can be really useful, like using a role attribute to describe the purpose of a custom component. So you write custom components, like you create a card, then you want to give it a role of card, so a screen reader knows, oh, even though you're using a div, this actually is a card. I already hinted at the importance of labels. Then there's also ARIA owns that creates hierarchies of elements and describes, for example, parent-child relationships. And I already mentioned ARIA hidden. Here's a library, it's called ALID.js, that is really useful to create accessible dialogues. I've used it on a project previously and I was pleasantly surprised, which is very important for example, for modal windows, right? So the purpose of a modal window is to focus the attention of the user onto a certain piece of the content, for example, a form that the user has to fill out, and at the same time blocking the rest of the application. So what happens if you don't hide the DOM elements underneath, as the user starts tabbing through the elements, suddenly the tab um, jumps to one of the elements that's underneath the modal window if you don't block them out. So all the work to block out all those DOM elements that are underneath, it's taken care of by ArcGIS. So that really helps you. You don't have to do all this work. The next step after you've made something accessible is to test it. And when you think of testing, you typically think of automated testing. And that's actually the first step of testing. There's a really nice Chrome extension called Axe. I added a screenshot here. It's part of the developer's tools, and you can analyze a page, and then you get a report with all the issues, and then you can go through each issue and fix them. That's really nice. But just because you run automated testing doesn't mean you're done. There's actually a slew of manual testing that you need to do to ensure that a site is accessible. And I call it the 3 no's. The first one is no mouse, the second one no monitor, and the third one no color, right? So imagine for no mouse, you actually put your mouse away and you only use your keyboard to navigate through the interface. And that's the first step in finding out if the document is laid out in a logical order. And that's very important for people that, for whatever reason, cannot use a mouse. The next one is no monitor. So literally turn off your monitor, rely on the screen reader like NVDA or Apple VoiceOver, or there's Chrome Vox if you're using Chrome, to let the screen reader read out the page and then try to navigate in the dark and see how you're able to go through all the screens. And the last one is no color. And there's a really nice Chrome extension that allows you to check the color contrast. And on the screenshot you can see in the developer tools, when you click on one of those colors, that you have a contrast ratio of something, and it tells you if it's AA or AAA compatible. So that's really nice. And guess what? That's already it. There's really not too much more to it. Obviously, you can get very granular, very into the weeds, but that's about it. So moving on, let's talk about accessible maps. This is a talk about accessibility at Esri, right? And in many cases, when I mention accessible maps, people tell me that's impossible. Maps cannot be made accessible. How can you access a map with your keyboard without a mouse? How can you do analysis, visual analysis, without eyesight? And the truth of the matter is there are lots of things you can do. And this list here, or the next section, aims at guiding you through those. And I will talk about color contrast, symbology, and Basemap layers, and then Kelly will take over and talk about frameworks and other tools. So color vision is possible due to photoreceptors in the retina of our eye. And those photoreceptors are known as cones. There are 3 cones, and they are light sensitive, and those cones enable us to recognize colors. Each cone is sensitive to either red, green, or blue light. I typically recall it by thinking of RGB, right? So normally the pigments inside the cones register different colors and send that information through the optic nerve to the brain. And this enables us to distinguish countless shades of colors, and we call it normal color vision or trichromatic. Now, the most common form of color deficiency is the red-green color blindness. And believe it or not, almost every 8% of the male population has a red-green weakness. So that's 1 in 12 people. So within our community here, I bet you I can find somebody. Less common is blue-yellow weakness, and the very rare one is to have a complete color deficiency. And then there's also a difference between having only a weakness or being completely blind. So those color deficiencies have a different range. Color deficiencies can be diagnosed through eye examinations, and sometimes you can even use simulators. I, for example, like in particular the Chrome extension. I want to see like the color blind, and I'm going to show that to you in a bit. But there's also a set of um, pseudo isochromatic plates that Dr. Ishihara has created. And whenever I did a research for this talk online, I came across those articles, and they gave those examples like Ishihara test for color blindness on the left hand side, what people with regular vision see on the right hand side, what red green color blind people see. And I always thought to myself, like, what do you mean? They're the same. Until eventually I started thinking, maybe I have a red green weakness. And yes, I do. So you can see many of the male population have this weakness. So it's not something to be taken lightly. But that doesn't mean that I don't see red or I don't see green. I only have difficulties distinguishing the fine nuances between red, green, and brownish colors. So what I want to do next is I want to show you a short demo how to style points using a feature layer. And this is a sample that I believe Christian Aiken has put out there. And as you can see, we have a base map, which is gray, and we have a bunch of dots on top. And in order to find out what the color contrast of those dots in comparison with the background is, I need to find out the color of the background. And it's here the base layer has a color of BF, BF, BF. That's some sort of gray. I can go to this online tool that's called contrast ratio, and I can paste in my background. And let's just find out what the color is for our Symbology. And as I scroll down here, where do I have my renderer? Oh, here's my renderer. Okay, I added a symbol color of light blue, right? So in my contrast ratio tool, I post in light blue, and I see that the color contrast is 1.2, which fails even the most basic um, contrast requirement, which is really bad, right? So coming back to our example, before I change something here, or actually let me change it real quick to, let's be very drastic here. Let's just change it to dark blue, and let's see how this map changes. Or let me actually change it here and see what our contrast is. Okay, so we see our gray background with the dark blue. Symbology has a contrast ratio of 8.31, which even passes AAA. In order to pass AA, I need a contrast ratio of 4.5. So let's see how it looks. Okay, you can see the difference. The points are clearly visible. There's actually one more thing I can do. I can enable auto scaling, and what that does is across different scales, I use the right point size, and you see how this makes a huge difference. And as I zoom in, the points change in size, and it's very clearly distinguishable. All right, let's go back to our presentation, and let's round it up with a slide about symbology. And most of those things I've already shown you, right? So try to enforce high contrast colors, and here are some tools that help you to enforce that. Add a halo around the points. And the interesting part here is if you have a white halo, then the color of your symbology actually only is measured against the white halo and not against the background. So that would be your color contrast. I already talked about scale-dependent symbols. There's a tool out there that was released with the latest JavaScript API version. It allows you to create color ramps, and you see there's one option for colorblind friendly palette. So that's a really great tool I encourage you to use. And you can use color boxes to improve the text legibility. That's really cool. You can think about it as like speech bubbles in a comic. And then also don't rely on colors alone. Use shapes, textures, and patterns instead. As an example, I want to show you a map here. And for a moment, just look at the map and see if you can identify all the features that are being shown. And then I will show you what I did with the symbology here. Okay, so all I've done now is I changed the symbology, and you can see at the bottom left corner, we had like the main building in green, which was really difficult to see. I changed it to an asterisk, which is very obvious. We have this hatched field with this red hatches on the green Basemap layer. It's very difficult to see. So now with this white crosshatch, that's very easy to see. The labels, I added those halos. I made them bigger. The symbology, I changed the symbology, and maybe it's not the most beautiful map, but it's accessible. And you know, it's not only accessible to people with disabilities, but believe me, your people out in the field, they will thank you as well. So last but not least, I want to talk about Basemap layers. That's a question that we get many times. Are there any accessible Basemap layers out there? Is there anything that Esri can provide? And the short answer is yes. There are a couple. The most obvious are the high contrast ones, like the light gray and the dark gray Basemap layers, and the Basemap layers that have less detail, like the human geography or the world terrain with labels. And all the way at the end, I will show you a slide with all the links. So don't worry, I got you covered. You will find them once you need them. How do you make a decision which Basemap layer to use? Well, that really depends on your operational data, right? You make the choices given the Basemap layers we have here. And if none of those Basemap layers work for you, you can always create your own custom Basemap layer using the vector tile style editor. And I want to give you a quick demo of to show you how easy it is to actually create your own vector tile basemap layer. And what I've done is I went online, I searched for colorblind safe palette, and I found this palette with 7 colors plus black and white. And you can see how those colors translate to different color deficiencies. And even though the colors don't look the same, they can still be distinguished. And that's our main goal here. So let's start up the vector tile style editor. Let's get started. Let's pick, for example, the world street map as our starting point. Now the map starts up and we see 4 small maps, that actually are like the preview maps at different scales. So as I change colors, you will immediately see a preview. So all I need to do is I will go in and I will change my colors. So for example, for land, I choose to use white. For water, I choose the color blue that I had before. Okay, let's see what this is here. Let's see. For water, I say I want my blue. For nature, and that's another easy one, we choose a green color. So that would be a 00, 90. I just copied out those hex colors. I never really remember them, right? And so for roads, I choose a yellow one. For 2, I have a little cheat sheet lying next to me, so I didn't really recall those numbers. And for boundaries, I use black. And then the buildings, I make like a crazy orange color, right? So again, the base map might not be the most beautiful one, but it has high contrast and it uses color safe palettes. The next thing I want to do is I want to change the labels, and for the labels I choose black as the text color, and then I create a halo around it, which is white, and then I increase the font size, and that's it. Again, it might not be the most pretty, the prettiest map, but it is for sure accessible. And so you can take this as a starting point, play around with the colors, pick a color by clicking on a map, and then maybe changing individual colors, maybe adding, removing later layers. Then you save it to your organization, and that way you have it available for use. All right, with that, I hand over to Kelly, who is going to talk about frameworks and other tools. Thank you very much. Kelly, take over.
Thanks, Michael. That was some great information. Let's take a look at how some of the frameworks handle accessibility. So Web App Builder, it's supported in some widgets and themes. There's a lot of good information on it here at this website. So they have a help topic that has information about their general accessibility support, the screen readers they've done some testing on, the themes that it's supported in, including some notes for the themes that have limitations, and the same information with the widgets. It's got information on the widgets that are have supported accessibility and the ones that have some limitations. So you can read through this and use this topic as a guideline. They also have a blog article that has some more information that's good for how to use the accessibility features in the Web App Builder. So again, this is something that you can refer back to and read through and learn about how you navigate through the elements and how the widgets work, the various types of widgets. So both of these resources are great and worth spending some time looking at. Experience Builder support's coming. They're working on making that site fully accessible, so look at support for that in a future release. StoryMap's team with the new StoryMap site has done a lot of work on accessibility. They've prioritized accessibility when building the new StoryMap viewer and builder. So out of the box, you get features like keyboard navigation, good color contrast. Those things just work. There is some work that you have to do, though. In order to assure that your site meets accessibility standards, you'll need to do your part and provide alternative text for any media that you add to the site, such as images, videos, maps, logos, etc. If you're using the classic story map, this is time to start considering migrating over to the new story maps to get this enhanced accessibility support. So I mentioned earlier that you have to do your part when building sites with story maps by writing good alternative text. So the StoryMaps team wrote a blog a few years ago, and it's linked to here, that has good tips, I think. Some of the content up top is dated and applies to the classic story maps. But the information here on what this alternative text is and how to write alternative text is still really relevant, and it's some great information. So they have tips on being concise. So you don't have to include phrases like this is an image of or a table showing blah, 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 because assistive technologies will announce the type of element that has focus, so they'll tell the reader that information. You just need to write good, concise, descriptive text. So they have some more tips here on not being repetitive. This is an important one because you may already have a caption for your image and you don't want to repeat that same information in the alt text, because screen readers will read both of those pieces of information, so then users are getting duplicate content. So you want those pieces of information to complement each other. So they have some more text here. Again, read through this all. And if you're not going to read through it, if you just want to skim, I think the examples below are really useful. So this one here, has this image, and if we go back to our slides, we can see that they have an example of the alt text for this. It has the context here. So this is current story section media, complementary. a spotlight illuminates Dr. King as he speaks at the San Francisco Cow Palace. So it tells you that information and tells you what's happening in the image without using the words like a picture of. It just gives you good information and useful information to somebody who's browsing through this story about what's happening in that picture content that they may not be able to read. So spend some time working on good alt text for that content that you add to make sure that your site is usable. ArcGIS API for JavaScript, so the 4X version of it, they've worked hard to ensure that the widgets are keyboard accessible. So they also prioritize fixing any accessibility issues. So if you find a problem with one of the widgets, you should submit an issue through support or report it on GeoNet, and the team will work hard to ensure that those issues are fixed. If you're working with maps, so if you're working with the JS API maps, there's some things that you kind of want to keep in mind when building an accessible site. The first one is, do you need the map? Maybe you can provide that information in alternate format, like a table, or include the map and a link to that information in a searchable table so that people can view, who are able to view and read the map content can do so, and then others have access to that same information but in that alternate format. There may be cases where the map just needs to be a simple static map showing a simple location, and you can provide some information. Like if you're showing the location of a store, you might say, this store is located at the corner of Willow and Fir across the street from the Shell gas station. That would tell people who couldn't see the actual map what that image was, what's happening in that image of the map. We also have this prototype that we wrote a couple years ago that is available on GitHub. So all the source code is available there. This app lets you tab into the app and move around the map and view pop-up information about the features in an accessible manner. This will work great if your map has a small amount of features in a relatively limited extent where people can easily navigate around with the keyboard. It's not going to work so great if you have thousands of features over a worldwide extent and people have to navigate around your map using just the keyboard, the arrow keys to try and find content. So the configurable apps available on ArcGIS Online, the most recent ones in the last 6 months or so, are all written using version 4X of the JavaScript API. So we can take advantage of those, the work the team has done to make those widgets accessible, which means the apps are also, accessibility work is prioritized, and we are working hard to ensure that they are all accessible. I have an example of one of those apps here. This is the Nearby app. This Nearby app by default has a map location, but we've created this no map option. So in cases where you don't need to have a map, somebody can look for, maybe they're looking for a deli in Juarez. So they can search, that information comes back, and it's all accessible via the keyboard, and this site is accessible. And this is the same site if we get rid of the no map option. So this is what it looks like when it has the map. When it has the map, it's also accessible because the searchable content that's shown in the map is accessible here in this side panel. So people can still navigate through this with the keyboard and access the information about the features that are displayed within this selection circle. So there are, again, lots more alternatives when working with maps. So you can provide descriptions of the content. So again, if it's a simple map, you just provide descriptive information explaining what's happening, like route directions, or like this example map here where they have a table of outages. So the outage information is reported in the map, but people can also access it through a table and access that same information. Or maybe you have an alternate means, so you've provided a toll-free service number for people to call and get access to that information. There are also exemptions that you can get where you can explain why meeting those standards would potentially pose an undue burden on your organization. But I would encourage you to think outside of the box a little bit and explore the other approaches like providing that information in a tabular format or a searchable list or some other way that people can access the same information without needing to resort to an exemption. We have a lot of references here to some of the content that we talked about and that Michael showed you. A lot of the links to tools here and various resources like the vector tile style editor and other things that Michael mentioned. So again, when these slides are provided, you will have access to all of these resources. So thanks for joining us. We hope to see you posting questions on the accessibility forum on GeoNet or sending them to the accessibility email alias. And thank you for attending.